Welcome back again. In this lecture we will take a closer look at people's vulnerability to typhoons and other environmental disasters, but of course we will also see that people are not just passive victims of disasters. People respond to disasters as well, and that is an interest that we anthropologists have very much. We will do this again by taking San Mariano as an example, but I want to emphasize that this is just an example. Processes like these happen all over the world, so please do keep that in mind. In some ways, we could say that over the past decades, people in San Mariano have become more vulnerable to the impacts of tropical storms. We already discussed one reason for that in our previous lecture. Deforestation and land conversion have made downstream communities like San Mariano more vulnerable to flash floods, mudslides and other drama. Another reason that we have to discuss has to do with population growth. Again, the number of people exposed to the risk of flooding, for instance, is greater simply because there are more people living in areas that are prone or vulnerable to disaster. In San Mariano, this is very visible. Many of today's villages didn't even exist 70 years ago. And that is a more general problem. In many countries, due to a combination of rapid population growth and poverty, more and more people, both in big cities as well as in remote rural areas, live in disaster-prone areas or areas that are likely to experience disaster. For example, low-lying coastal areas. This is central Philippines. And floodplains. This also means that generally speaking, and again I'm saying generally speaking, the poorest people are most exposed to the risk of disaster. My question to you is, why would that be the case? Why do you think that poorer people are generally speaking more vulnerable to disaster? Well, there's a number of reasons. Firstly, poorer people are more likely to move into areas that richer people don't want to live in because they are less suitable to live in. Secondly, their houses may be less disaster-proof because they may not have the materials to build more disaster-proof dwellings. And finally, they may lack the evacuation means, transportation means to leave from an area in case an emergency arises. But there's other reasons. Another type of vulnerability has to do with people's livelihoods. Livelihoods are the way people make a living. And I will explain this by saying a little bit more about the farming livelihoods of people in San Mariano. You already know that the farmers of San Mariano mainly grow yellow corn, irrigated rice and banana. Most of these crops are produced for sale. Does anyone know how we call these crops? Crops that you produce for sale. It's very simple. We call them cash crops. Growing a cash crop, like for instance yellow corn, which is by the way used as animal fodder, not for consumption in the Philippines, requires a lot of inputs. Think for example about fertilizer, pesticides, but also high yielding corn seeds. These are all expensive things that most farmers in the Philippines are not able to pay for themselves. So what happens is that they take loans from the buyers of the corn. The people who eventually buy their corn will first provide them with credit to buy all these inputs. And then when the corn harvest is ready, they will pay back these loans. And very often these loans come with very high interest rates. But apart from cash crops, people in San Mariano also grow crops for their own consumption. For example, they grow rain-fed rice, they grow cassava, and they grow sweet potato. They also grow vegetables. They come in various shapes and sizes. And we call all these crops subsistence crops. So subsistence crops are crops grown for own consumption. And subsistence crops are extremely important for farmers in San Mariano. They provide a safety net and they provide the bulk of people's diet. Now, before we move on, I would like to make sure that you're still with me. So please check for yourselves if you understand what we mean by livelihoods and what is the difference between cash and subsistence crops. And if you need to, you can rewind this video. Okay, got it? Now the question is, what happens in the case of a typhoon? Cash crops like yellow corn and banana are not typhoon resistant. This means that farmers who are very dependent on these crops are also very vulnerable to typhoons. And as typhoons occur so regularly, they face the risk of failed harvests every year. And as you will understand by now, when harvests fail, farmers' income is lower as well. But it's not only that. They also have difficulties to pay back any debts they have with their buyers. This situation often repeats itself. Farmers have debts with their buyers and therefore they are obliged to produce for those same buyers next year again in order to repay their debts. But once in that situation, it can become increasingly difficult to get out of it. And this pattern is what we call a cycle of debt. If farmers become structurally dependent on their buyers through such a cycle of debt, we speak of debt bondage. But as I said, people are not just passive victims, right? They're not just passive victims of environmental crisis, especially when disasters like typhoons happen very regularly and over a long historical period. Preparing for such disasters and recovering from them afterwards are part and parcel of life. And anthropologists are very much interested in understanding how people do that. They're interested in coping mechanisms, by which I mean the strategies to deal with crisis. Now, before giving it all away, based on what you know now from the situation in San Mariano, could you think about a number of possible coping mechanisms that the farmers in San Mariano employ to help themselves through such disasters? Okay, you may have thought of this one, you may have not, so I will tell you now. One important coping mechanism of the people in San Mariano is already embedded in their livelihood system. Most people in San Mariano do not only grow cash crops, they also grow the subsistence crops that I told you about. They grow their own food. For example, subsistence crops like cassava are less vulnerable to typhoons simply because they grow underground. And another common response to typhoons is to make use of what the typhoon has actually caused. Some people start fishing after typhoons in areas that have become overflown. And there's also people who may collect driftwood after a typhoon has washed down timber and other driftwood from the forest. And they use it to rebuild their houses or they sell it to make up for lost income. Of course, increasingly, people in emergency situations are also supported by relief aid operations organized by governments, church-based organizations, caring individuals. Even you yourself may have been involved in providing assistance in times of crisis. Anthropologists also study how such relief aid programs relate to and exchange existing coping strategies and how aid recipients perceive these programs. Such information is extremely important to make relief aid more effective and also to avoid creating dependency. Now, if we look at all these different strategies, we see that the people in San Mariano employ different coping mechanisms. So, subsistence crops are grown, people make use of relief aid, but they may also create additional income with the example of the driftwood, for example. But in addition to that, people may also resort to borrow money. And in fact, the corn buyers that I previously mentioned are very important in that context. Although farmers may be very dependent on these buyers, they can also offer help in the short run. And that is precisely why that relationship of dependency very often continues over time. Finally, most families have one or more family members who live either in the capital city or abroad, like Maria. Maria really is one example among many, many in the Philippines. And a person like Maria, through her network overseas and through the income she generates, can provide a safety net for her parents and other relatives back home who have to cope with a disaster. So by investing in education, parents hope that their children will find a bright future elsewhere in a nice office job, and this job in turn provides those at home with a safety net in times of crisis. Let me wrap up. Anthropologists study how people look at and respond to disasters. We want to know how people perceive risks, and we want to know how they minimize the risks. What different strategies do people develop over time to recover after disaster, especially in areas where disaster is much more the norm than the exception? This was my last online lecture. I hope you enjoyed it and that you found it useful. And I very much look forward to meeting you in person in Leiden.